Crispin, Cross of Lead Chapter 4. Following my escape from John Aycliffe and my night of forest hiding, it was the sound of a tolling bell that woke me. Drum had come and the Stromford Church was announcing early morning prayers, prime. In haste, I made the sign of the cross over my heart, offered up my daily prayer and listened closely. All I heard was the sound of the bell and muted forest babble, nothing to alarm me. Once awake, however, I could think only of what I'd seen the night before, the meeting in the woods of the steward and the stranger, nor could I remove from my mind the steward's hateful look when he brought down his sword with the dear intent of killing me. Even so, I tried to convince myself that it would not matter. In the past Aycliffe had treated me badly. His attack on me the night before was not that great an exception. Why should he, I told myself, be concerned that I, a nobody, had seen him at his forest meeting? It seemed my best course of action would be to return to my home and act as though nothing untoward had occurred. With the coming of morning's light, it took little to determine where I was. I made my way toward the village. Since my mother had been a cotter, one who held no land in her own right, she and I lived in a rented one-room dwelling that stood at the far edge of our village by the northern boundary cross. A thin thatch roof kept out most men. Earth was our floor. And since it was at some distance from the village, I was able to remain hidden from those who had already gone to their daily labor. I was just about to emerge from the woods and run towards our hut when I caught sight of the bailiff, Roger Kinswathy, and the reeve, Odo Langland. Not only were they carrying pikes and axes, they were heading for my cottage. Unsettled, I drew back quickly and concealed myself behind some bushes to observe their intentions as they entered our small building. Perhaps they were looking for me, because they emerged in moments. But then, to my great shock, they began to use their tools to peel the structure down. The cottage, being of small, mean construction, could not withstand their assault. Within moments it was little more than a heap of thatch, wattle, and clay. Not content with that, Kinsworthy produced a flint from his wallet, struck sparks and set ablaze the place I had called my home for 13 years. Deeply shaken, I fled back to the forest. As I went, I kept asking myself why they should have done such a thing. I could not believe it was merely because I'd seen the steward in the forest the night before. Once within the woods, I decided to go to a high rock which stood near the forest's edge and overlooked our village. Though the rock was difficult to climb, I'd done so before on one of my solitary rambles. It was to be hoped that I'd see something to help me understand what was happening. It was not, however, till mid-morning, which I knew by the position of the sun and the ringing of the church bell proclaiming terce, that I reached the road. Once having made sure I was alone, I climbed. While the road was not an easy ascent, at some places it was little less than a cliff, one reached the pinnacle. Once there, I took the further precaution of lying down, only then did I lift my head and look about. Before me, like some rolled-out tapestry, was my entire world beneath a sky as blue as Our Lady's blessed robes, a contrast to the greening spring that lay abundant everywhere. Overhead swallows flitted free as birds ever are. To the west meandered the river Strom, glittering like one silver ribbon in the golden sun. At this point the river ran at a shallow depth. Like most, I could not swim, but for much of the year, one could wade across. Above and below this ford, depending on the season, the water ran quite deep. A few paces from the river's bank, on the village side, stood one of the stone crosses that marked Stromford's western limit. Covered by mystic markings, this cross had been erected when St. Giles had once appeared. There, on the river's law, tree-lined banks, stood our noble's house, Lord Furnivall's manor, the grandest house I knew. It was where the steward had lived for years in the absence of the knight. With stone walls 2 levels high and small windows, the manor was to me like a castle, high, mighty and impenetrable. Inside, one had never been allowed to enter, but I'd been told, was an arched hall with a long trestle table and benches, several sleeping rooms and a chapel. On the walls hung pictures of saints, along with ancient battle shields. The lower level was a large storage place meant for the wheat and other foods the village produced. Opposite the manor house, across a road, was the mill. Smaller than Lord Furnivall's dwelling, it was built of stout timbers, with grinding wheels of massive stone. These wheels were turned by river water delivered by a run. Not only did the mill grind our wheat and barley, at a cost, it contained the ovens where we villagers, by the steward's decree, baked our bread, which required yet another fee. A road led from the river bank. Once a traveler had crossed the river, a road led east and named another road that rut north and south. Where these roads met, our stone church, St. Giles by the river, stood with its ancient bell. Above and below the church were our dwelling places, some 40 cottages and huts of wattle and daub, thatch and wood, packed earth and mud, all in varying shades of brown. North of the village was the commons, when we peasants grazed our own oxen and sheep. Here too were the archery butts, where men of age were required by King Edward's decree, to practice every Sunday. It was also the place when the public stocks and gallows stood. The land for growing crops was laid out in long, narrow strips. One of 3 strips was planted with barley, another with wheat. The final third lay fallow for the grazing of the manor's cattle. As for the 2 roads that passed through Stromford, all I knew was that they led to the rest of England, of which I had no knowledge. And beyond England, I supposed, came the remaining world, great Christendom, our priest called it. But in all my life I'd never gone past the boundary crosses which marked the limits of our village. Everything, from the woods, the cottages, the manor house, the mill, the roads, the growing lands, the common, even the mum itself, to the tiny crofts behind our cottages used for planting herbs and roots, everything belonged to Lord Furnivall, who held it in the king's name. Indeed, the steward said WT belonged to our lord as well. Like all villagers, we were required to ask the steward's permission to be excused from work if ill, to grind our wheat or bake it, to buy or sell, to travel from our parish, to many, even to baptize our children. In return we gained 2 things: when we died there was a hope of heaven, and Lord Furnivall protected us from the Scots, the French, the Danes and the wicked infidels. but that morning I had little doubt I'd never be protected again. Crispin, Cross of Lead Chapter 5. As I gazed from the high rock, all seemed calm and completely normal. Men, women, and children were in the fields, at their lawful labor, plowing, weeding, sawing, where they would remain till dusk. But as I watched, I saw 2 horses with riders emerge from the manor house. By the way one of the riders sat, not well, one was sure it was John Ackliff, the steward. The other man, I supposed, was the one I'd seen with him the night before. The 2 rode slowly to the church, dismounted, and then went inside. I waited. The church bell began to ring. It was not the slow, rhythmic pealing that announced the canonical hours, but a strident, urgent clamor, a call to hear important news. In the fields, people stopped their work and looked about. Within moments, they began to walk towards the church. Others emerged from cottages. It did not take long before the entire village was assembled in front of the church porch. Once all had gathered, the bell ceased to ring. 3 men stepped from the church. The first to come was the steward. Then the stranger. The last was Father Quinnell, whom I recognized because old age had marked him with a stoop. The trio placed themselves before the doors of the church, where the steward briefly addressed the crowd. Then the stranger held forth at greater length. Finally, Father Quinnell spoke. Then, followed by the steward and the stranger, as well as all the villagers, he led the way back into church. The church bell now began to toll again, as if a mass were being announced, but for whom or what purpose I could not guess. I was tempted to go forward, but my apprehension, greatly increased by the destruction of my home, kept me back. Instead, I bowed my head in prayer. O great and giving Jesus, I, who have no name, who am nothing, who does not know what to do, who is all alone in thy world, I, who am full of sin, I implore thy blessed help, or I'm undone. Crispin, Cross of Lead Chapter 6. In time, people emerged from the church. Most went their several ways, some back to the fields, others to their cottages. Others remained in groups, gossiping, or so I supposed. I'd have given much to hear their words. As for the steward and the stranger, they remounted their horses and retreated to the manor house. Some of the village men went along. Once, Mom, I had to decide what to do. I thought of going to the village for help, but there was only one person whom I could trust, Father Quinnell. Had not my mother trusted him, had not he, done in the village, treated me with some kindness? Even you, I decided to speak to him. I saw the steward and the bailiff emerge from the manor house, along with men from the village. They were armed with glaives, long poles with sharp blades attached, as well as bows. I even saw a longbow. Just to see them made me know my worst fears had come true. A hue and cry had been raised against me. Clinging to the road, I watched the search party for as long as I was able. But when they became hidden by forest cover, it war time for me to flee. My visit to the priest would have to wait until the night.